Rule 3 of Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, is make friends with people who want the best for you. The takeaway messages I got from this chapter were 1. Don't be friends with Peterson because he's very judgy. 2. Don't help other people because it'll just make their situation worse. 3. If you do help people, it's because you're a narcissist and are doing it for personal gain. And 4, of course it contradicts some of the other things, make sure you help people who legitimately need help. So, let's see if you get the same messages out of this that I did. Welcome back to the channel. Hopefully everybody had a nice little Peterson vacation. I know I did. Last week's video, Lily's story, is one that I've been wanting to make since I had a channel, so it was good to get that done. And it was also a little bit serendipitous because last week's video was talking about unhealthy and toxic relationships, and today's video we are talking about relationships that are kind of unhealthy. Today we are going to go through some Peterson backstory and some questionable life advice. But before we get that, I'm going to awkwardly insert the channel business stuff here because most of my views are coming from non-subscribers. So if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe. A bunch of different tools and more back-end help open up from YouTube at 1,000 subscribers, so make sure you click subscribe. Also, in the description, I've got links for my Twitter, Discord, and Patreon. So if you are one of the early birds on my Patreon, you will get a super special place in the credits. Ooh, enticing. Fear of missing out. Sign up to the Patreon. Last little thing before getting into the chapter, let's talk about my narrative cues in the video. So this format with these colors means we are talking about Peterson's words directly, the book content, the ideas, things like that. This is for my interpretations, extrapolations, personal commentary, personal take, that sort of thing. And this is for examining science references or bringing my own science references in. Sadly, you won't be seeing a lot of this one in this video. All right, let's get on to why friends aren't fun. Peterson grew up in Fairview, Alberta, which he describes as a very small rustic town in the middle of the prairie, which didn't really have a lot of things for kids to do. He also describes the 5 long months of winter, which includes long stretches of 40 below days and even colder nights, before spending some time really driving home how cold that is. I lived somewhere like that during my husband's postdoc, and we found out that -40 doesn't matter the units. Fahrenheit, Celsius, it's about the same. Like, it's right around the crossover point between the 2 units. So it's cold. It's so cold. And my kit for teaching, because that was the primary reason I was leaving the house, is winter boots. I had a couple pairs that came up to my knee, and they were very insulated. And then to get to school, I would wear sweatpants over whatever pants I was going to be teaching in. And then shirt, teaching sweater, another sweater or jacket or something just as another layer for warmth. A wool coat that I've had for some time and is very warm, comes down to my knees. A scarf to protect the chest area. And then a face thing, I forget what they're called. It's not quite a baklava, but something that came up to here. Sunglasses, a big ridiculous furry hat, and gloves that were like $60 because I've got Raynaud's syndrome and cold is no bueno. So even with all of that, the minute you step outside of your nice warm building into that weather, just, you know you've made a mistake. The warmth and the moisture just gets sucked out of your lungs and your sinuses, and it's miserable. He also brings up the lengths of the days and the nights, as living that far north does make your nights considerably longer in the winter. Having lived at different longitudes, it's amazing how much of a difference that makes. The more north you go, the shorter the days are in the winter, and oh my gosh, it can feel ridiculously short in the winter time when you're pretty far north. Like, you go into work in the morning and the sun's not up yet, and then you're leaving work and the sun's already setting. Like, it's crazy. All this talk of the misery of winter was to set up the importance of having friends to occupy the time. When Peterson was still living at home, he was friends with a guy called Chris, and him and Chris had a lot of the same interests. Peterson describes Chris as being a natural engineer, but then also notes that something had gone wrong in his family. He says that the rest of the family, which was a couple sisters, mom, dad, they were fine, but Chris was angry, resentful, and without hope. I'm not a clinical or counseling psychologist, but it seems like these behaviors don't just come out of nowhere. Maybe Chris has ADHD that's been unchecked and is untreated. Maybe there's facets of his home life that Peterson just isn't aware of. Or maybe just Chris is wired to be an angry guy and oppositional and other things. But regardless, I'm kind of surprised Peterson doesn't check in on this or come back to this, given he's a clinical psychologist. Peterson says that Chris's truck was sort of an expression of his anger and his rage. There were dents inside and out, and he says that Chris's truck was the exoskeleton of a nihilist. Couldn't resist squeezing that one in there, could you, Peterson? So apparently, if you don't keep your vehicle in tip-top shape at all times, you're a nihilist. It's not that you don't have the funds to fix relatively minor body damage, or you're not bothered by it. Nope. You're a nihilist. Which means, I guess, that my husband and I are nihilists because we've been driving a truck since 2004 that has body damage from hail, like a crazy hailstorm that gave some people concussions. And it paid off the truck, so great, but we've been driving it just with the hail damage. I guess Peterson must not watch Mythbusters because, if anything, that hail damage is making our truck more aerodynamic. It's like driving a golf ball. He goes on to describe a cycle that Chris had where he would go out, drive recklessly, smash his truck into something. His dad would fix his truck and then buy him something else, like an ice cream van or motorcycles or whatever. Chris said that he was unhappy with his relationship with his dad, and Peterson speculates that the issue was that his dad wasn't spending enough time with him because he was chronically ill. I'm still leaning towards the idea that there was some stuff going on behind closed doors that Peterson wasn't made aware of. Peterson was also friends with Chris's younger cousin, Ed, and Peterson said that Ed had a bright future ahead of him, but that was squandered because of his friends and getting into marijuana.
Marijuana isn't bad for everyone any more than alcohol is bad for everyone. Sometimes it even appears to improve people. But it didn't improve Ed. It didn't improve Chris either.
Peterson is mum about whether he partook or not. We wrap up this section with Peterson talking about them mostly killing time by driving the country roads. Cultural knowledge for the youths, care of Dr. Caceres. Teenage Wasteland appears as a lyric in the Who song Baba O'Reilly off of Who's Next. This song was apparently in response to seeing the audience at Woodstock, mostly teenagers, young adults, blasted out of their mind on mind-altering substances and calling it a teenage wasteland. Peterson says that if they weren't out driving, they'd be at a party.
I did not like teenage parties. I do not remember them nostalgically. They were dismal affairs.
Is anyone here surprised that Peterson would be the too cool for this place buzzkill guy at a party? He describes not liking the dim lighting, the loud music, the general aimless vibe, and then goes on to trash talk some of the people at the parties, other than the girl I later married. She was fine. He says that the parties and the driving were all that kids his age wanted to do at that time because doing extracurriculars wasn't cool. And he blames that not coolness on the counterculture revolutions of the 60s. maybe this is just a difference in where I grew up and when I grew up compared to Peterson, but extracurriculars were normal and fine and not judged. I did have some friends in middle school who were rather Daria-esque in the disaffected and not enthusiastic about anything, and that has been kind of hard to shake off, but I was in a bunch of extracurriculars. Like, I was in dance, I was in astronomy club, I was in bowling, which was a bit of a mistake because I suck at bowling, but free t-shirt, so I did it. And a lot of kids were in a lot of extracurriculars, and maybe it's a difference between where I grew up and rural Canada, but yeah, to blame it on the countercultural movements of the 60s causing everybody to become these disaffected, too cool for extracurriculars thing, like, that seems like a stretch. He describes the people who left this little town as knowing that they would leave from a very young age. And he breaks down the people of his age group into those who would later go on to college and those who wouldn't. And that's fine. But the quote that rustles my jimmies is,
"For those from less educated families, a future that included university was simply not part of the conceptual realm."
Hold up. None of my grandparents had anything beyond a high school degree, if that. And my parents had associate's degrees, so I mean, that's some college, but it's not usually what people talk about when we're talking about higher education degrees. And I knew from a very young age that I wanted a PhD. The topic area may have been unclear and changed several times, but I knew I wanted a PhD. And my family supported me on that. They loved the idea of me going to school and doing that. And they supported me as much as they could. I mean, it was very clear to me that if I was going to do that, I had to support myself, so it was very important to make sure I got the scholarships and everything else, but they still supported me how they could. It was not outside the conceptual realm for my family that I would be going to college or going to postgrad. And maybe this is down to a generational difference, but I kinda doubt it. While I'm on this kind of rage tangent, this reminds me of the money remark he made about the lower SES people not being able to use money responsibly. Page 16 of the paperback version if you're keeping track. So between lower SES people don't know how to use money and the uneducated don't even think about going to college, there's kind of some classist, hierarchical society overtones here, like, screw social mobility, that is not going to happen. If you're poor and uneducated, your family and your children and your children's children, they're all going to stay that way. I don't like it. He tries to justify this a little by saying that people had no excuse not to go to college because it was really cheap to go, but then he also says that jobs were plentiful and that he
earned more money in 1980 working in a plywood mill than I would again doing anything else for 20 years. No one missed out on university because of financial need in oil-rich Alberta in the 1970s.
Holy shit, is he really missing his own point here? If there was a bunch of these well-paying jobs in abundance that he's talking about, there'd be less incentive to go to school at that point. A lot of people just want a job that pays well, is relatively safe, and has benefits for them. And if they can get that without going through college, they're going to take that job, especially if they don't have this burning passion to learn more about biology, psychology, physics, chemistry, whatever. Like, if you don't have that passion and there's jobs available, why go through this extra work for a degree that you don't really care about? With the type of physics my husband does, we've lived in a number of oil and mining towns, and I can tell you, oil field workers and miners are paid well. They were making more starting salary than my husband was with a PhD in physics. So it's a very well-paying job. And so for some people, especially if they don't really have a burning passion for liberal arts or something, it makes sense to just pack it up, go work at the oil fields or in the mine for as long as you can. And granted, these jobs are not sunshine and rainbows. They are hard jobs. but they pay well. So you pack it up, you go do them for as long as you can, and then when you're done, hopefully you've saved up enough that you can transition into an easier job and then retire. It makes sense. Peterson even says it himself. He made more working a lumber mill than he did well into his academic career, probably full professor, I'd guess. And unless you have a burning passion for this stuff, why would you go to higher ed? And it really seems like Peterson's metric of success is having a PhD and becoming a professor. And it really seems like he looks down his nose at people who haven't pursued higher education. And that's not success for everybody. It shouldn't be for everybody. We need people doing all sorts of jobs, not just being college professors. No one likes a judge, Peterson. Peterson found new friends at the community college he was going to out of his hometown, who were also aiming upward, and he liked the idea of being able to reinvent himself in this new town because people didn't know his entire life history like they did back in his hometown. He finished up his undergrad degree in Edmonton, and while he was there, he was living in what sounds like a nice apartment with his sister. And he found out at some point that Ed, Chris's younger cousin, had moved to Edmonton, and so he invited him over. He was hoping that Ed would be living up to this potential and amazing intellect and everything that he saw in him, but he was kind of disappointed when Ed actually showed up.
His eyes were the telltale red slits of the practiced stoner. Ed had taken some job, lawn mowing and casual landscaping, which would have been fine for a part-time university student, or for someone who could not do better, but which was wretchedly low-end as a career for an intelligent person.
Jesus fucking Christ, Peterson, this was a friend of yours. Accept him. Like, what? What? Do you see what I mean about him being judgy? Because, come on. And I'm guessing that most physical labor is wretchedly low-end to him for somebody who is intelligent. I mean, never mind that people can be small business owners and do this as a passion. Nope. Either they must not be intelligent, or it's below them and they're not living up to their potential. For fuck's sake. Peterson was even more unhappy with the friend that Ed had brought along. Peterson says that this friend was baked out of his mind, and at one point said, "My particles are scattered all over the ceiling." He was pissed. Judgy. I personally would want to know more about the guy whose particles are now scattered across my ceiling. That guy sounds fun. And it's not like these guys were moving in as roommates, they were just visiting. But apparently this will not do in Peterson land. Peterson insisted that they leave and berated Ed for bringing his friend along and called him the useless bastard of a companion. And according to Peterson, Ed nodded, which meant that he agreed with him about the entire situation. I guess Chris at some point later wrote Peterson a letter talking about his experiences and his friends, and Peterson included this letter in Maps of Meaning. And in this letter, Chris describes his friend group as people who hated themselves as much as he hated himself. Peterson puts forward the question of why his hometown friends were unwilling or unable to move or to change their friendships and improve the circumstances of their lives. He floats the idea that maybe it's inevitable that people end up going down the paths that they do. Chris is brought up again, having
had a psychotic break in his 30s after flirting with insanity for many years. Not long afterward, he committed suicide.
Flirting with insanity before committing suicide. Now is not the time to be poetic, Peterson. Peterson speculates if Chris's marijuana use helped or hurt him before coming back to nihilism.
Was it the nihilistic philosophy he nurtured that paved the way to his eventual breakdown? Was that nihilism in turn a consequence of genuine ill health, or just an intellectual rationalization of his unwillingness to dive responsibly into life?
Ah, that's it. The National Institute of Mental Health, World Health Organization, other research bodies, they're looking in the wrong place. It's not genetics or environmental factors that lead to mental illness, which then leads to suicide. Nope. Nihilism. Is it too early to take another Peterson vacation? It is? Although, of course, he's asking this in the form of a question. That old trick. Was President Obama born in Africa? If you're having to ask it like this, chances are the answer is no. Some central questions for this chapter are asked. Why do people keep friends that aren't good for them? Why do people continue to live in places that aren't good for them? Peterson says people do this because people believe that they deserve these bad experiences or friends or places and so seek them out, or because of a Freudian concept called repetition compulsion. The gist of repetition compulsions is that people repeatedly go into similar bad situations for a handful of possible reasons. Maybe they keep going into toxic relationships because they're trying to gain mastery over the negative emotions associated with that relationship, or because no better alternatives exist. But this is a Freudian concept, so the scientific validity of all this is a little bit suspect. He continues with a metaphor in that
people create their worlds with the tools they have directly at hand. Faulty tools produce faulty results. Repeated use of the same faulty tools produces the same faulty results. It is in this manner that those who fail to learn from the past doom themselves to repeat it. It's partly fate. It's partly inability. It's partly unwillingness to learn, refusal to learn, motivated refusal to learn.
Now we come to the serendipity of my video production order. Last week we talked about my friend Lily's experience in an abusive relationship, and arguably her ending up in relationships like that over and over again was because of an inability to learn from the past. But it's not like she was falling blindly into each relationship. She would get out of a bad one, not want it to happen again, and try to do things differently, but getting the right information from the right sources at the right time was really hard. Her discovering that she had codependent tendencies that was making her an ideal partner for these people didn't happen overnight. That took luck and a lot of hard work in getting that information when she needed it. Stop being vague, me. Lily was trying to improve and learn from her mistakes, but it wasn't until a year ago that she actually got the critical information she needed to be able to learn and move on and grow in a way that prevented it from happening again. But this does come back to one of my takeaways, that Peterson is a judgy guy. And an extension of this quote is to say that people who are in these bad relationships are intentionally doing it to themselves because they are refusing to learn from their mistakes. Peterson says that in addition to having bad friends because of this unconscious drive to hurt ourselves, or because we feel like we deserve it, and this would have been a good place to tie in rule 2 with that shame and guilt and all of that, but he doesn't. Another reason Peterson gives for making these bad friendships is because we have a drive to try to save that person. This then gets tied back to his recurring anger at victimhood.
Nonetheless, people will often accept or even amplify their own suffering as well as that of others, if they can brandish it as evidence of the world's injustice. There is no shortage of oppressors among the downtrodden, even if, given their lowly positions, many of them are only tyrannical wannabes.
I just need the pull yourself up by your bootstraps and I'd have a bingo. Next, we're told that it's hard to tell the difference between somebody who legitimately needs help and somebody who is just trying to take advantage of other people. Even for the person who's asking for help, he says that they might not be able to tell the difference. But if somebody is trying to help other people And they're doing this not because the world is awful and they haven't just learned that everybody who needs help is trying to take advantage of them. They must be doing it to fuel their vanity and narcissism. And his evidence for this is from a story by the Russian novelist Dostoevsky called Notes from Underground. And in this story, the main character fantasizes about helping this woman before ultimately humiliating her. And I guess because of that, if we're trying to help somebody, we're only doing it to build ourselves up. And Peterson predicts that the counter-argument people would come at him with is basically Jesus Christ. Yeah, I know. I've seen the comments on Reddit and YouTube about Peterson trying to renormalize Christianity or pandering to Christian sensibilities, and I keep responding that I'm trying to just present what's in the book without really my bias coming into play with how I'm interpreting things. I'm trying to focus on the science, the arguments, and not necessarily on this component. And I'm doing this because it seems like a lot of people who criticize Peterson take the somewhat glaringly obvious implications of what he's writing or saying and arguing against where you end up there, and are met with either himself or his followers arguing that no, that's not what he meant or not what I said, you're taking it wrong. So, dear viewer who is aggravated by Peterson's continual insistence on using Christian examples, I am so there with you. I feel it. This example has a huge what from me in the margin. Like, I get it. I understand. It's aggravating. And why would an expert, purported expert, on world religions and symbols and everything keep falling back to using the comfortable and familiar ones to American/Western audiences? His use of Jesus here is intentional. No disputing that, but this is where I get hung up. And it's unclear to me why he's doing it. I see a couple possibilities. On the one hand, he could be pandering. He could be trying to convince people who are somewhat vulnerable that Christianity is the way to contentment and this is what they need to do. But I also see it from sort of a teaching standpoint. He's trying to convey a point. So instead of setting up some myth that most people aren't familiar with, needing to talk about the myth itself, talk about the cultural context of this myth, really establish it before making whatever point he's trying to make, he can just use an example that most of his audience is familiar with and then move on from there. And it's a much simpler, straightforward process. And where you fall on this kind of depends on how cynical you think Peterson is in what he's trying to accomplish. Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. All I can say for sure is he keeps using biblical examples in this without necessarily any justification for why he keeps using biblical examples as opposed to other cultural myths or stories. I don't know. I'm going to leave it up to you guys for why he keeps using these, and let's just move on to Peterson and Jesus. So, Christ helped people, and
how dare I cast aspersions on the motives of those who are trying to help? But Christ was the archetypal perfect man, and you're you. How do you know that your attempts to pull someone up won't instead bring them or you further down?
You're making it real hard, Peterson. I'm willing to grant that some guy named Jesus ran around 2,000 years ago, had some adventures, and did all that. I'm not willing to say that he was the Son of God or a perfect man. And I don't see how a story about a guy who claimed to be the Messiah means that if we try to help people, we're going to fuck it up. Peterson sets up a scenario with a group of employees on a team who are just doing amazing. And their boss is also in charge of a guy who's not doing so well. And so the boss moves this guy who's not doing so good into this awesome team to try to help this guy learn. And Peterson argues that according to the research, which we'll talk about, the entire team's performance is going to suffer now, be dragged down by this guy who's not doing so good. Holy shit, there's references here. The reference supporting Peterson's claim that bringing a subpar guy into a good team is reference 64 on the screen here if you are so inclined to read I.O. papers from psychology. This reference discusses different ways of measuring team performance, such as looking at the aggregate score of a team for their supervisor's rating of their job, or looking at the lowest performing member, or looking at the highest performing member. This paper also looks at personality traits and its impact on people's performance ratings. They did find a difference with low conscientious team members dragging down the performance of regular conscientious team members, somewhat in line with what Peterson was talking about. But the study was observational in nature. They didn't add bad eggs to good performing teams. They just looked at what teams exist, looked at the different personality traits, and then correlated that with the performance measures. They didn't manipulate anything. It's just correlation and statistics. So Peterson is sort of overstretching and misrepresenting the results of this experiment. The other included reference for 64 is with teens. And so this experiment was testing the hypothesis that interventions for at-risk youth do more harm than good. And if you remember being a teen, you probably won't be surprised by the outcome of this study. Basically, at-risk delinquent teens, when put in an intervention that involves a lot of time with other at-risk delinquent teens, the intervention doesn't reduce the undesirable behaviors. If anything, these interventions actually increase these negative behaviors the intervention was trying to prevent. Interesting experiment, but it doesn't really support Peterson's claim here. If he was talking about teens and their behaviors and impact on each other, especially like at-risk teens, then sure. But he was talking about an employee group with doing okay, bringing in a subpar employee and that employee dragging the rest of the performance down. And that's not what this experiment was talking about at all. So he's kind of misrepresenting the results of this experiment. Not on the level of a dissolving lobster brain, but still not what the experiment was talking about. Reference 65 is also talking about youth. And they had similar findings to reference 64, the at-risk teen one, but they also suggest that early, direct adult interactions with children can help reduce the bad outcomes later in their life. Also similar to the reference 64, Peterson isn't quite representing the results accurately. He says,
"The same thing happens when well-meaning counselors place a delinquent teen among comparatively civilized peers. The delinquency spreads, not the stability. Down is a lot easier than up."
But this isn't what reference 65 did. There was a group of teens who were all at-risk, delinquent youths, and some of them received the intervention, some of them did not, they were the control, and later outcomes were measured between these groups, and the intervention didn't seem to help. And so it's not a case of a bad apple being put in with the good apples and causing all of them to be delinquent. That's not what happened. But Peterson is misrepresenting the results. Surprise! Here's another honker of a quote, but I don't want to withhold any unadulterated Peterson from you.
"Maybe you are saving someone because you're a strong, generous, well-put-together person who wants to do the right thing. But it's also possible, and perhaps more likely, that you just want to draw attention to your inexhaustible reserves of compassion and goodwill. Or maybe you're saving someone because you want to convince yourself that the strength of your character is more than just a side effect of your luck and birthplace. Or maybe it's because it's easier to look virtuous when standing alongside someone utterly irresponsible."
Deep breath, deep calming breath. Okay, so maybe this shift is more obvious to you, but it took me to about this point in the script for the shift in helping people to saving people really come into clear focus. And I probably shouldn't be surprised by this from somebody who sees things as very A or B. Order or chaos, masculine or feminine, saving people or condemning them to hell. Why does it have to be this extreme, Peterson? Why can't people just help people? Why does it have to be this heroic act of saving? Hero's journey, Jung, of course. It's a heroic act to save people. Heroes don't just go around helping, they save. Back to the quote itself. I never really got into Friends, the TV show, but I do know that there's an episode where one character was trying to make the point that there's no such thing as a truly selfless good deed. You always benefit from it. And so I feel like if there was going to be a source in this paragraph, it would be to that Friends episode. And going back to something else I've said in previous videos, if you read this book more as an autobiography and not so much a self-help book, you start to see some really interesting things about Peterson and his personality coming out. He tells us to assume we're doing the easy option when we're saving people. Sort of a Occam's razor for shitty people, I guess. So, all other things being equal, if someone is helping someone else, we should assume that they're doing it just for personal gain and not for any of the other hard options. His explanation of this point is done with a scenario of him talking to somebody in a failing marriage. And he says that everybody's taking the easy option in this because the person in the failing marriage isn't doing any of the hard work to actually save the marriage, they're just talking. And him, by talking and listening, is not doing any hard work in helping them save their marriage or in his own life. But he's also enabling this delusion that this is helping anything.
Are you so sure the person crying out to be saved has not decided 1,000 times to accept his lot of pointless and worsening suffering simply because it's easier than shouldering any true responsibility? Are you enabling a delusion? Is it possible that your contempt would be more salutary than your pity?
As I said, it was rather serendipitous that last week we talked about Lily's story. I spent a lot of time talking to somebody in a failing marriage, and this marriage was failing for a very good reason. But we did more than just talk. Lily was pulling together an escape plan to get out of an abusive relationship. And Lily wasn't crying out to be saved. She was calling out to me because I knew her and I knew her ex well enough that I could say, like, yeah, no, this situation's not right. You should trust your gut on this because he's messing with you. He's intentionally manipulating you or trying to manipulate the situation, and you're right. This is fucked up. Lily may have accepted her suffering at some point, but at another point, she was done with that. She was ready to move on and do the hard work to make sure she didn't end up in a relationship like this again. I was not enabling a delusion. Her marriage needed to end for her to be healthy and mentally well. Contempt is something that Lily was always afraid of and part of why she hid what she did in the relationship. Thankfully, the only contempt she really experienced was from her ex-mother-in-law. Everybody else who's not fucked in the head has been supportive. Not pity, not contempt, support. And Peterson was a practicing clinician. Super. Or maybe the reader isn't necessarily trying to go out and save people, but they are in relationships with people who are bad for them, just because it's the easy thing to do. And he says that everybody who is in one of these bad friendships is
bound by an implicit contract, one aimed at nihilism and failure and suffering of the stupidest sort. You've all decided to sacrifice the future to the present.
Again with the nihilism, geez. I guess if it's not order and chaos, it's gotta be something. So I've said this before, but I'm on the older end of the millennials, and I don't feel like I've settled into my forever home yet. Part of that is the academic lifestyle where you go to undergrad, you go to grad school, there's a postdoc, and it takes a while to settle into your job that you're going to work until you stop working, but I don't think I'm necessarily alone in this feeling. Another part of this is the economic climate we find ourselves in. When I was applying for jobs in grad school, the hordes of professors who were supposed to be retiring and leaving spots open for the younger people coming up didn't retire. Their retirements poofed up in smoke with the recession, so they couldn't retire, so there weren't the jobs available. I've never had a real job. If it weren't for my husband's good skills and luck and connections, I don't know what stability would look like for us. Peterson instructs that you need to investigate why somebody needs help before helping them. And this is because not everybody who needs help deserves it. And the justification for this is that if you don't investigate and see why they need help, then you might be robbing them of their agency. So maybe they need help because of actions they did, even if they're in a situation they say they had no part in creating. They might still have had a role in that, and if you ignore that, you're robbing them of their agency. Somewhat surprising, but he doesn't give an example for this, and I got one. So there's a person with a car driving along the road, and it breaks down. And they're now sitting there like, what happened? Car no go. And you know for a fact that this person has never done any maintenance. They haven't checked the oil, they haven't looked at the other fluids, they haven't rotated the tires, like they have done no maintenance. Either through ignorance or neglect, the car is now not working. But because the person doesn't really know any better, they think they had no part to play in this car now not working. Alright, put a pin in this example, we'll come back to it.
It is far more likely that a given individual has just decided to reject the path upward because of its difficulty. Perhaps that should even be your default assumption when faced with such a situation. Failure is easy to understand. No explanation for its existence is required. In the same manner, fear, hatred, addiction, promiscuity, betrayal, and deception require no explanation. It's not the existence of vice or the indulgence in it that requires explanation. Vice is easy. Failure is easy too. It's easier not to shoulder a burden. It's easier not to think and not to do and not to care.
There's the rub. Failure is not shouldering the burden, perhaps, of being with a capital B. Also not clarified by Peterson. Timescales. Giving in to the vices is easy short term, but maintaining them long term is not easy. Going back to the broken car example, yeah, short term, not maintaining the car was easy because the person didn't have to go get the oil changed or do any of that. It was easy to just drive the car around. But long term, failure is now hard because they're having to deal with a broken car. Peterson continues, wanting to have some guarantee that your suffering is not the demand of martyrdom for my resources. Basically, that if he helps, that he's not just postponing the inevitable failure and maybe being dragged down into failure town with the person that needs help. And then the stylistic brainworms are back.
Maybe your misery is the weapon you brandish in your hatred for those who rose upward while you waited and sank. Maybe your misery is your attempt to prove the world's injustice, instead of the evidence of your own sin, your own missing the mark, your conscious refusal to strive and to live. Maybe your willingness to suffer in failure is inexhaustible, given what you use that suffering to prove. Maybe it's your revenge on being. How exactly could I befriend you when you're in such a place? How exactly could I?
Before getting into the content here, I want to point out a tonal shift or a voice shift that happens in how Peterson is communicating with the reader. So rule 2, by comparison, is very much a we have this shared guilt and shared naked problem, or kind of a life coachy you that's trying to be helpful, or at least as helpful as it can be when you're talking about an inherent instinctual guilt that we all have because of an imaginary sin fruit. This chapter, but this section in particular, Peterson has shifted from using an inclusive sort of we to more accusatory and sounding like he's put out by the reader needing help. It reads like he's yelling at a dog who shit on the carpet. My reaction to this tone from Peterson is to tell him to fuck off If he doesn't want to be helpful, then fine, but don't be a dick about it. But I'm not the target audience for this book. And so, of course, this tone he's using is intentional, but why is he using it? And so I'm kind of wondering if he's fulfilling this role of daddy for people and yelling at them so that they will accept whatever comes next more willingly. It's also interesting that this ends with him questioning why or how he could be friends with somebody in this position. And I kind of wonder if this is a well-rehearsed speech with him that he trots out whenever somebody asks for help, like with moving or something. This quote also sounds like he's angry at victims again. Like, people can't just have been dealt a bad hand or bought in a lemon or whatever. Like, there has to be a reason why they're failing that's their own fault.
Success, that's the mystery. Virtue, that's what's inexplicable.
Then there's some more failure is easy, things fall apart, and then comes the flood. If you didn't know the Bible, this would make no sense.
I'm not saying that there's no hope of redemption, but it's much harder to extract someone from a chasm than to lift him from a ditch. And some chasms are very deep, and there's not much left of the body at the bottom.
So I guess if you're going to be narcissistic and help someone, you need to do it early. Redemption, is it? Helping someone change their tire is redeeming them of their failure sin? No small acts in the Peterson universe. But if you are to help early, you need to make sure that the person wants help. Because if they don't want help, they won't be receptive to the help you give. And enough said there, apparently, because we're moving on.
If I stay in an unhealthy relationship with you, perhaps it's because I'm too weak-willed and indecisive to leave, but I don't want to know it. Thus, I continue helping you and console myself with the pointless martyrdom. Maybe I can then conclude about myself. Someone that self-sacrificing, that willing to help someone, that has to be a good person. Not so. It might be just a person trying to look good, pretending to solve what appears to be a difficult problem instead of actually being good and addressing something real.
Yeah, there's some hedging with the perhaps and the maybes, but still, fuck off, Peterson. Serendipity. Last week we did a postmortem of my friend's toxic relationship. And it was an unhealthy relationship. But Lily didn't stay in the relationship to prove that she was a good person. She stayed in it for as long as she did because she wanted to believe that her ex was a good person. Despite all the awfulness he kept throwing her way, she was holding on to this idea that underneath it all, he was a good person. Lily wasn't weak-willed or indecisive. If anything, it took a lot of resolve for her to stay in that relationship as long as she did without breaking. Calling anyone in an unhealthy relationship weak-willed is bullshit. Yes, he hit a nerve.
Maybe, instead of continuing our friendship, I should just go off somewhere, get my act together, and lead by example. And none of this is a justification for abandoning those in real need to pursue your narrow, blind ambition in case it had to be said.
Nothing says a good friend like your friend looking down their nose at you, then fucking off to live a better life, hoping that you will follow their example. Yeah, okay, fine. Maybe he's talking about things like addiction or other big life things that you can do. But if that's the case, he should be explicit about that. What sorts of failures are we talking about? What sort of successes are we talking about? Like, don't leave it at this vague level that of course he is. Yeah, Peterson, that second part did have to be said. With the rest of the chapter being what it is, it sounds like you shouldn't help anyone ever because it's never for a good reason. How about instead of having this one little throwaway line telling people to help people, you rework the chapter so that helping people's part of the process? No? Okay, it's your book.
Friendship is a reciprocal arrangement. You should choose people who want things to be better, not worse. It's a good thing, not a selfish thing, to choose people who are good for you. It's appropriate and praiseworthy to associate with people whose lives would be improved if they saw your life improve.
Surface level, okay, yeah. having friends who want the best for you is probably a good thing. But on a deeper level, what does this mean? Their lives would be improved if your life improves? What? This also seems like he's back to talking about relationships as transactional again, like he did in Rule 2, but at least the more friendly life coach tone is back and not the dog shitting on the carpet tone. Then he describes the ideal friends almost as you would ideal parents. Rewarding good behaviors, punishing bad behaviors. Seriously, he thinks friends should punish bad behaviors. And then describes bad friends basically as gaslighting narcissists. Granted, having a toxic friend probably isn't a good idea, and gaslighting just isn't a good time, but I don't need surrogate parents to be my friends. Brainworms are back for seconds.
It is for this reason that every good example is a fateful challenge, and every hero a judge. Michelangelo's great perfect marble David cries out to its observer, "You could be more than you are."
Is this why David gets to be naked? Because he's perfect? And again, I guess Rule 2, with all the naked shame and guilt, doesn't apply to him? Anyways, no small acts in the Peterson universe. Everything is life or death, piety or sin, order or chaos. Although, order and chaos have not made an appearance in this chapter. I guess I wasn't the only one who needed a Peterson vacation. He wraps up this chapter by saying that it's hard to have good friends because it takes strength to stand up next to these people as mere mortals, and also warns not to take compassion or pity when you fail. I guess having friends isn't fun for Peterson. Shocking, I know. Also, are we supposed to infer that good friends will never ask for help on things, and that the minute somebody does ask for help, they're now a bad friend? Revisiting the takeaways from the beginning. 1. Peterson is a judgy person. I don't think it would be very fun or fulfilling to be friends with him, and he seems like a really intense guy about everything. The second was to not help people because it'll make their situation worse. I think his advice for this is to lead by example instead of trying to help people, but I don't see how that actually helps if somebody needs help moving. Number 3 is if you're helping, you're doing it for selfish reasons. Or should I say shellfish reasons, eh? Number 4 is to help people who really need help. Although how you tell people who really need help from people who are all the negative, awful things he kind of described those people as is unclear. Now, let's try to give some less bad advice for friends. First, introspecting on yourself and your situation and your friends and your environment and all of that periodically is a good idea. You can take stock of things. If you have a friend who continually just doesn't make you happy and if anything makes you miserable, it might be good to reduce contact with them and maybe kind of try to cut them out of your life a little bit. It's also good to take stock on where you are and what you're doing. If you would like your situation to be better or certain aspects improved, you can work on that. Maybe you have some friends who have similar goals, maybe you don't. But either way, it's fine. Now, granted, this life advice is certainly for the more normal range of experiences. I am not at all qualified to be talking about addiction or severe life trauma, but for the most part, I think this stuff works on a general basis, about the same that reading his book would. The other part of my advice would be to just remember that everybody's human and we all make mistakes. And sometimes these mistakes that are made, we need help recovering from them. And that doesn't make anybody less than other people if they need help. Peterson, listen. Needing help doesn't make a person less than anybody else. It doesn't. So yeah, friends and helping and stuff. Next week, we'll do Rule 4, which is to compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. How could that possibly go wrong? Alright, like, comment, subscribe, Twitter, Discord, Patreon. See you next week. Bye.